Hey guys! Tonight we're wandering back in time, through misty courtyards, where flickering lanterns cast long shadows, and a drumbeat hums softly in the background. You might think we're heading toward a fan-twirling geisha in a silk kimono, but tonight's story doesn't start there. It begins with men. Yes, really. Sword-wielding, sake-loving, biwa-plucking men in powdered faces and flashy robes. Because the first geishas weren't women at all. And what they did, it was half cabaret, half chaos. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your city and local time below. I want to know who's drifting off with me tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's rewind to the 1600s, Japan's Edo period. The samurai ruled the land, the shogunate had locked down power, and cities like Kyoto and Edo, what we now call Tokyo, buzzed with new wealth and strict order. In this world of warlords and walls, the people needed something softer at night. Music, laughter, stories told under lantern light. Enter the taiko mochi. Picture this. A high-ranking samurai is sprawled on the tatami, sake in hand, sword resting nearby. Across from him sits a man in colorful robes, not a soldier, but an entertainer. He strums a shumasin, recites poetry, maybe tells a wickedly inappropriate joke that gets a few nervous laughs. This is the taiko mochi, or male geisha. His job, to charm, distract and soothe powerful men without ever challenging their status. He's part court jester, part party planner, and part walking drama club. Now don't picture him as some meek background character. These guys were artists, improvisers, masters of performance and subtle manipulation, and they were everywhere, especially in the pleasure quarters, the licensed red light districts where courtesans, musicians and storytellers mingled in a blur of incense and painted screens. But eventually, the spotlight started shifting. Somewhere around the mid-1700s, women began slipping into this performance space. At first, it caused a stir. Female entertainers were supposed to be courtesans, trained in seduction, not storytelling. But these new women weren't there to sell their bodies. They were there to entertain. They played shamisen, recited poems, joked with clients, and shockingly, often outshone their male counterparts. Historians still argue whether this shift was organic or strategic. Did women train deliberately to challenge the taiko mochi? Or did patrons begin requesting them, tired of the old routines? We may never know. What we do know is that by the late 1700s, the term geisha, which means art person, began applying more and more to women. The men didn't vanish overnight. Some held on, especially in the more traditional quarters of Kyoto, but the rise of the female geisha was unstoppable, and with it came a new mystique. Here's a quirky fact. One of the earliest recorded female geis was thrown out of the profession. Why? Because she was too popular. Courtesans complained she was stealing all the clients just by being witty, charming and not, charging extra for anything else. Because that's what separated geis from courtesans. They weren't there for sex, they were there for art, performance, presence. It was a fine line, and a dangerous one, but it gave geishas power in a way few women had in Edo society. Still, don't let the elegance fool you. Being a geisha was subversive. These weren't polite housewives or demure daughters. They earned their own income, walked city streets in dramatic finery, spoke with men as equals, and made entire rooms go silent when they raised an eyebrow. In a society where women's roles were mostly domestic, geishas were living, breathing exceptions, and they paid the price for that. Early geishas faced constant scrutiny, from jealous wives, from suspicious magistrates, from courtesans who feared competition, and brothel owners who didn't want pure entertainers cutting into their business. So how did they survive? They leaned into regulation. In fact, the geisha world became defined by its boundaries. Geishas had licenses, rules, and strict codes of conduct. Where they could work, what they could wear, how late they could be seen in public, all carefully monitored. Paradoxically, that structure is what gave them freedom. By playing by the rules, They built a world within a world, a floating one, an imagined space of beauty and illusion. The term ukiyo means floating world, a poetic description of the nightlife and pleasure districts where geishas bloomed. And it's a perfect phrase, because everything about this new role floated just above reality. A geisha wasn't quite a wife, not quite a servant, not quite a courtesan. She was a living artwork, temporary, ephemeral, dangerous, only if you forgot she was playing a role. One of the earliest woodblock prints of a geisha shows her walking in profile, sleeves trailing, a shimisan slung across her back like a weapon. Her face is unreadable, her lips are half smiling. Behind her, courtesans glare. Ahead of her, men turn to look. She is completely alone and absolutely in control. By the end of the 1700s, geishas had become more than entertainers. They were icons. They influenced fashion, speech, even poetry. Samurai quoted their jokes. Merchants tried to marry them. Women copied their hairstyles. And everyone pretended they weren't secretly obsessed. Tonight we met geisha history at its unexpected beginning, not with silk and seduction, but with men in makeup, sipping sake and telling stories to make warlords laugh. Next time, we'll follow the women who walked into that world, took the stage, and never gave it back. The first time a woman walked into a party as a geisha, she probably wasn't welcome. Let's just get that out of the way. The men in the room, especially the male geishas, or takameichi, would have gone stiff with awkward silence. This wasn't a world that welcomed disruption, especially not from someone wearing perfume. But she stayed. And once she opened her mouth, maybe with a joke, maybe with a song, things started to change. By the mid-1700s, female geishas weren't just a novelty, they were a problem, a beautiful, charming, disarming problem. Because the pleasure quarters, those licensed districts for entertainment and yes, physical transactions, were carefully ordered. Everyone had a role. Courtesans did one thing, takemochi did another. Merchants paid, samurai strutted, and everyone knew their place. But female gaze has blurred the lines. They didn't sell sex, but they were undeniably alluring. They weren't courtesans, but they competed for the same clientele. They weren't supposed to dominate a room, but they did. With music, wit, and an ability to say exactly what a powerful man didn't know he needed to hear. It started, unsurprisingly, in Kyoto. Kyoto's Gion district was a labyrinth of alleyways, lanterns, and hidden rules. There, in the shadows of shrines and under the sway of willow trees, female geishas slipped into the scene. They were called on geisha, woman geisha, though eventually the qualifier fell away. They simply were geishas. Their rise wasn't polite. At first, they were considered intrusive, even vulgar. Some were banned from performing, others were accused of undercutting the courtesan's rates. One even got dragged into court after a high-ranking client left a courtesan's house early, just to hear her sing. Historians still debate whether geishas were empowered artists or clever survivors, carving out space in a limited system. The answer is yes. And also no, they were something else entirely. Shapeshifters. Artists of illusion. They didn't break rules, they bent them, until they looked like something new. Here's a delicious little side note. Some of the earliest female geishas has had day jobs as street performers. They played shamisen under cherry trees, told ghost stories to rowdy crowds, or juggled with fans. These weren't the refined figures you see on postcards. They were scrappy, funny, and often flirted in ways that made polite society clutch its beads. But their talent, unquestionable. One in particular, nicknamed White Heron, was known for her slow, graceful dances and razor-sharp tongue. There's a surviving letter from a Kyoto merchant begging her to perform at his birthday party. Not entertain, perform, which was scandalous language at the time, since performer suggested equal status. She agreed, only if his wife attended too. Power move. Absolutely. By the 1770s, things shifted again. Courtesans, once queens of the pleasure quarters, began to falter. Their rituals were lavish and slow. Days of fanfare before a customer even got a hello. But geishas, they were quick, smart, affordable. You could hire one for a dinner, a poetry reading, a tea ceremony, even a private viewing of cherry blossoms. They didn't pretend to fall in love. They pretended to be entertained by you and let you believe it was real. But let's pause here, because we need to address something sticky: the myth of the geisha courtesan overlap. Even now, people get confused. Memoirs, movies, mistranslations, they've all blurred the line. But in feudal Japan, the difference mattered deeply. Courtesans were about desire. Geishas were about art. You didn't sleep with a geisha, you were captivated by her. Sure, affairs happened, we'll get to that. But by definition, a geisha who sold sex wasn't a geisha anymore. She'd be dismissed from her house, barred from performances, and cut off from the intricate network that made her life possible. Reputation was everything, and a single whisper could unravel years of training. So how did they climb the social ladder, if not by seduction? With presence. Think about it. In a room full of men, powerful, moneyed, jaded, who's the most dangerous person? The one who listens. Geishas were trained to read the room. Literally, they'd walk into a party, assess the dynamic, and shift their energy to fit what was needed. If the mood was dull, they brightened it with a song. If a samurai was brooding, they drew him out with a philosophical question or a playful tease. If tensions were high, they poured sap like diplomats, smoothing over slights with a glance. And the result? Influence. Not in the sword-swinging, land-owning sense, but in the ability to sway decisions, redirect tempers, and keep men talking long enough to forget their grudges. Geishas started appearing at more exclusive events. Elite tea houses began to favor them over courtesans. Even wives who initially saw them as threats started inviting them to ceremonies, knowing a good geisha could elevate a gathering without humiliating anyone. There's a beautifully preserved letter from a noblewoman in Edo, writing to her cousin about the first time she met a geisha. She calls her as graceful as a dragonfly and twice as sharp. She also notes, with a tinge of envy, that her husband hasn't stopped humming her song for a week. It wasn't just men who admired them. Women saw something in geishas that society didn't always allow: independence, poise, the ability to command a space without apology. And while not every woman wanted that life, many respected it. By the turn of the 19th century, female geishas were no longer a novelty. They were a class, a profession, a force. And the men who started it all, the taikomochi, still around, still respected, but largely faded into the background. The spotlight had shifted, and it wasn't going back. The floating world wasn't real. That's the first thing to understand. It shimmered like a dream. Bright silks, laughter behind folding fans, music drifting from behind wooden slats. But it was as carefully constructed as a stage set, and at the center of that illusion, the geisha. In Japanese, they called it ukiyo, the floating world. A poetic name for the pleasure quarters, those licensed districts in cities like Kyoto, Edo, and Osaka, where you could forget the weight of duty for a few hours. Within their gates, time slowed, rules bent, and beauty was currency, not just physical beauty, but mood, movement, emotion. The kind of beauty that could intoxicate without touch. It was here, in this blurred space between performance and desire, that the geisha became legend. By the early 1800s, geishas had transcended the role of entertainer. They weren't background figures at banquets anymore. They were the reason certain banquets happened. Men of rank, samurai, merchants, even minor lords, would travel for days just to spend an evening in the presence of a famous geisha. She didn't need to be the most beautiful woman in the room. She needed to make you feel like you were. And that was the art. The geisha wasn't selling herself. She was selling atmosphere. Her walk, her voice, the angle of her neck as she laughed. None of it was accidental. She had trained for years to be effortless. And yes, that's the paradox. To appear natural took excruciating work. The floating world had layers. It wasn't all soft shadows and fluttering fans. It had gatekeepers, debts, rivalries, hierarchies. And at the top stood the Jaiko, the Kyoto term for a fully trained geisha. Below her, the Maiko, apprentices in brightly colored kimono, their necks powdered, but their eyes still wide with nerves. And beneath them, invisible to guests, The Okiya house mothers, servants and teachers who ran the machinery behind the illusion. One geisha could make a tea house famous. She could ruin it too. If she was too aloof, too available, too political, or not political enough, she'd vanish from the registry. Clients wouldn't be told why. She'd just disappear. But for those who thrived, the floating world offered a kind of power few women had elsewhere. Not legal power, not political, but social power. The ability to influence conversations that happened behind screens. The ability to choose which client to favor and which to quietly reject. The ability to walk into a room and have every voice drop. Of course, it wasn't all jasmine-scented candlelight. The pressure to maintain that aura was brutal. Geishas lived under constant surveillance, not just from society but from each other. A single misstep could trigger gossip, and gossip in the floating world spread faster than wildfire through bamboo. Rivalries were fierce. Tea houses competed for the best geishas, and geishas competed for the most prestigious clients. There were whispered stories of hairpins dipped in ink to ruin a rival's wig, or couriers bribed to delay a competitor's invitation. All done with smiles and silence, of course. Still, the rewards were real. A successful geisha earned far more than most women of her time. She could support her family, fund her retirement, even sponsor younger girls into the profession. And her name, her jame, carried weight. Men wrote poems about her, artists painted her, kabuki actors mimicked her walk. Some even married her. This was rare, and often discouraged. Marriage meant retirement from the geisha world. But sometimes, a wealthy patron called a dana would offer to support a geisha exclusively. More on that later. For now, let's stay in the glow of the banquet hall. A typical evening in the floating world began with ceremony and ended in subtle chaos. The guests arrived first. Businessmen, aristocrats, warriors no longer at war. They sat around a low lacquered table, shoes removed, sleeves rolled back. Sake flowed, food was served, and then like clockwork, the sliding door opened. Enter the geisha, never flustered, never rushed. She moved like ink across parchment, slow, deliberate, with no wasted gesture. She didn't bow too deeply, unless it was funny. She didn't flatter needlessly, unless it was for effect. She knew how to read the room, faster than any diplomat. Her first words, often a joke. Light, dry, delivered in the local dialect, with a twist that made one man laugh and another blush. She'd pour the sake just right, 2 fingers width from the rim, and offer it with a tilt of the wrist that made the guest feel like a lord, even if he was sweating in borrowed silk. The shamisen would come out. A song, maybe a game. There were dozens, some innocent, others hilariously inappropriate in the most polite way possible. If you lost, you drank. If you won, she might let you think you were charming. But here's the secret, she was always in control. Geishas were trained not just in performance, but in emotional manipulation. She knew which topics to avoid, which guests needed a little extra attention, which one was going to try something stupid. And when he did, she'd shut it down with a laugh, a flick of the fan, a reminder that she was there by choice. One quirky tradition from the Gion district. If a guest became too bold, the geisha might switch out his sake cup mid-pour, subtly replacing it with a larger one to throw off his rhythm. If he didn't notice, she'd whisper the mistake to another geisha later, and they'd all giggle in the back room. Passive-aggressive. Maybe. Effective. Every time. Historians still argue whether the floating world was empowering or exploitative. Was it a space of freedom, or just another gilded cage? The answer is probably both. But for many geishas, it was the only space where they could be seen, truly seen, not as wives, daughters, or servants, but as artists. As someone once said of the geisha, she is the woman of all women, and the woman of none. It always starts the same way. Someone leans in over a cup of sake and asks, with a smirk, "So, were geishas basically courtesans?" The geisha smiles, but inside, she's already left the conversation, because that confusion, centuries old, frustratingly persistent, has shadowed the profession since the very beginning. So tonight, let's pull back the silk curtain and settle it once and for all. Geisha were not prostitutes, but the world they lived in, oh, it brushed right up against that line. To understand the difference, you have to understand the architecture of the yukaku, the licensed pleasure districts of Edo period Japan. Imagine a gated world, with narrow lantern-lit alleys and enclosed tea houses. Inside this maze, you'd find actors, dancers, musicians, courtesans, and yes, geishas, each with their role, their price, and their rules. Courtesans were called oren. They were beautiful, educated, extravagantly dressed, and incredibly expensive. Booking an oren wasn't a last-minute decision. It required days of formalities, gift-giving, and elaborate processions that often looked more like weddings than transactions. Physical intimacy was part of the deal, but only after a tightly choreographed series of rituals. Geese, meanwhile, were legally and socially forbidden from offering sex as part of their service. Their realm was performance, not passion. They played shamisen, danced, recited poetry, and made awkward samurai laugh. They entertained. That's it, officially. Unofficially, well, things got murkier. Historians still argue whether romantic relationships between geishas and their clients were as rare as the rulebooks claimed. Some geishas had dana wealthy patrons who supported them financially. Were those relationships platonic? Sometimes. Other times, no. But even then, the arrangement was private and exclusive. Geishas didn't juggle multiple romantic patrons. That would have blurred them too closely with the courtesans, and their reputation was everything. In fact, Geishas worked hard to draw a visible line between themselves and the oren. Take clothing, for instance. Courtesans wore ornate, vividly embroidered kimono, tied in the front, a signal that they were available. Geishas wore simpler patterns, with their orbi tied in the back, subtle but deliberate. Even their makeup spoke volumes. While both wore the iconic white base and red lips, geishas often used softer touches. Courtesans flaunted extravagance. Geishas whispered elegance. Here's a quirky little tidbit. In Kyoto's Gion district, geishas would walk with slightly shorter strides than oren. It sounds silly until you realize that a courtesan's footwear, think platform shoes tall enough to need stairs, made slow, dramatic steps necessary. Geishas, in contrast, moved with a quicker, livelier grace. It sent a message. I am not here to seduce you. I am here to outwit you. And they often did. Clients who expected more from geishas than entertainment were usually in for a humbling night. A misplaced hand, blocked with a fan, an inappropriate comment, answered with a joke so sharp it drew polite laughter from the whole room, at the man's expense. Geishas had to be masters of refusal, wrapped in silk and lacquered charm. Still, the association lingered. Why? Partly because outsiders couldn't always tell the difference. Westerners, in particular, arrived in Japan during the late 1800s and saw beautiful women in elaborate outfits being paid to entertain men, and assumed one thing. The term geisha became an umbrella word for anything vaguely exotic, female, and mysterious. It stuck, and the damage followed. Wartime propaganda didn't help either. During World War II, American soldiers often referred to any woman working in nightlife, hostess, comfort woman, or otherwise, as a geisha. The term became muddled. Even today, you'll hear it misused in pop culture, travel brochures, even high school essays. But in Japan, the line remains stark. There's even a saying among traditional geishas: we sell a dream, not a body. Let's not pretend the system was spotless, though. Geishas lived under strict control, especially during their apprentice years. Young girls, sometimes as young as 6 or 7, were adopted into okiya houses and trained relentlessly. They were taught to sing, dance, serve, entertain, and to do so without complaint. For many, it was a form of opportunity. For others, a gilded trap. An apprentice couldn't leave without repaying her debts to the house. These debts included the cost of her training, her costumes, her room and board, all meticulously tallied, often inflated, until she earned enough to buy her freedom or attract a patron who paid it for her. She was property, not in the legal sense, but in every practical one. So while geishas weren't prostitutes, their lives weren't free from exploitation. The illusion of control was part of the art, too. But over time, the profession evolved. Laws were put in place. Age limits rose. Okiya mothers became mentors, not wardens. And the geisha reclaimed her role as a woman of independent artistry. Still, some secrets persisted. There are stories, half true, half whispered, of high-ranking geishas who did cross the line, who took lovers, who disappeared with a client and never returned. One tale tells of a geisha in Osaka who vanished one night after a party, leaving only her shamisen and a single silk slipper. The tea house claimed she retired. Others claimed she eloped. Some say she still plays in the back alleys on full moon nights. Was she a geisha or something else? That's the point. The line was never fully visible. It shimmered, like everything in the floating world. Behind the painted smiles and swishing sleeves, behind the shamisen melodies and choreographed elegance, there was a house. Not just any house. The house. The Okiya. If the geisha world was a garden of illusion, the Okiya was the soil. It was where a geisha slept, ate, trained, paid her debts, kept her secrets, and sometimes very quietly broke her heart. To outsiders, it looked like a quaint wooden home nestled on a quiet Kyoto street. But inside, it was a finely tuned machine of hierarchy, pressure, and precision. Let's step inside. The Okiya was always run by a woman, usually older, formidable, and fond of rules, sharpened over decades. This was the Okiya-san, or mother, though if you were picturing cuddles and warm miso soup, think again. She was mentor, manager, disciplinarian, and sometimes jail warden. Her job to raise apprentices into successful geishas, and also to make sure the house profited. Most geishas didn't own their lives. Not at first. If they came in as children, their entire career was fronted by the house. Training, wardrobe, hairstyling, even the cost of that first teacup they cracked during dance class, logged on a ledger, and Okiya mothers kept very detailed ledgers. A young girl in the house, usually between the ages of 6 and 12, would start with chores, polishing floors, fetching water, listening. Lots of listening. She'd watch the older geishas apply their makeup, practice their dances, and speak to clients in that strange half-whispered voice that somehow made a man feel interesting. She'd see the glamour, but also the strain behind it. Then, if she showed promise, she'd become a shikomi, a pre-apprentice. That meant more cleaning, but also attending classes at the local geisha school, dancing, music, etiquette, dialect training, calligraphy, and how to bow at just the right depth for just the right length of time. Fail your class. You weren't punished. You were shamed, subtly, consistently, until you got it right. Historians still debate whether girls were pressured into geisha training or if families truly believed it was a noble path. In some cases, it was clearly financial, a way to guarantee food, lodging, and a potential future. In others, it was tradition. Some girls begged to enter their okiya after seeing a geisha pass in the street. Some were orphans. Some had no choice at all. But once in, the world narrowed. Everything was about observation and mimicry. How to walk, how to laugh, how to dress. You weren't allowed to show teeth when you smiled. You didn't swing your arms when you walked. And for the love of all that was lacquered, you never let your kimono touch the ground. Every mistake was corrected, gently if you were lucky, with raised eyebrows and murmurs if you weren't. Eventually, if your posture was perfect, and your musical timing didn't offend the ancestors, the Okiya mother might arrange your misadashi, your debut as a maiko, or apprentice geisha. That's when your debt really started growing. Because now, you wore the full costume, the weighty kimono with sleeves so long you could trip over them, the red collar to show you were still in training, the iconic white face makeup with the nape of the neck left bare in 2 stylized dips, one of the few places considered sensually appropriate to show skin. You were beautiful, unmistakable, and incredibly expensive to maintain. Your hair alone, styled in elaborate gravity-defying shapes by a professional. Sleep on a wooden pillow. Yes, a block of lacquered wood designed to keep your hairdo pristine while you suffered through 8 hours of dreams where you accidentally spilled tea on a lord. Once a girl became a maiko, she was paired with a senior geisha called her 1A-san. big sister. This wasn't always a warm relationship. Some were genuinely caring mentors, others competitive, critical, or indifferent. Either way, you followed her everywhere. You carried her shumasin, you learned by imitation. She decided when you were ready to speak, sometimes even when you were allowed to smile. Maiko weren't supposed to speak freely with clients. They were there to look radiant, laugh at the right moments, and stay one beat behind the geisha, who'd already mastered the rhythm of the room. Still, within the okiya, the bond between girls could be deeply intimate. They shared the same cramped sleeping quarters, practiced dances late into the night, cried over blisters and bruised pride, and sometimes, after hours, whispered dreams they weren't supposed to have, of running away, or falling in love, or just getting a full night's sleep without a wig cutting off their circulation. One fringe account, found in an apprentice's diary from the 1840s, talks about a Maiko named Sayo, who would sneak steamed buns from the kitchen and hide them under her obi sash to give to the youngest girls in the house. She was never caught, but her nickname Obi Mochi Sayo was whispered for years like a ghost story. The okiya was a home, yes, but not always a haven. If a Maiko failed to attract clients, if she didn't progress fast enough, or if she made enemies with the wrong people, she could be released. That meant going back to her family, assuming they'd take her, or worse, being absorbed into lower forms of entertainment, where the makeup was similar, but the job was very different. Yet for those who succeeded, the house could become something powerful. Once a geisha earned enough to pay off her debts, she could choose to stay and support the next generation. Some even became okiya mothers themselves, shaping the future of the very world that once shaped them. Because for all its restrictions, the okiya created artists. It took girls from humble beginnings and transformed them into women who could silence a room with a single look. It was not a soft life, but it was never meant to be. The transformation began before dawn. A young Maiko sat perfectly still as hot wax stiffened her scalp. An assistant combed, twisted, and pinned her real hair into a style so elaborate it would take 2 hours just to finish. The older geisha nearby had it slightly easier. She wore a wig, still heavy, still uncomfortable, but easier. Then came the white, that iconic, otherworldly white foundation, applied with a flat, damp brush. Not just on the face, down the neck, along the jaw, just past the collarbone. A single slip and the line between elegance and clownishness was crossed. Next, red and black accents around the eyes, thin, precise brows, a small doll-like mouth painted in deep vermilion, only the center colored in for Maiko, a signal of youth, and finally, the nape of the neck, left partially bare, with 2, or for the especially bold, 3 unpainted wedges at the base. In a culture where exposed cleavage was scandalous, the neck was the sensual focal point. By the time she stood to put on her kimono, she wasn't a girl anymore. She was illusion incarnate. A geisha's appearance wasn't just about beauty. It was coded, symbolic, and ever-changing with age, rank, season, and occasion. Every piece had purpose, and the process of becoming that image, relentless. Let's start with the kimono. For a Maiko, the sleeves were long, so long they nearly brushed the floor. This fur-shadowed style emphasized youth and unmarried status. Her obi, the wide sash tied around her waist, trailed down her back like a tapestry. It could take 2 assistants just to wrap and secure it. And it wasn't just for show, it weighed nearly as much as a winter coat. A full outfit could easily weigh 20 pounds. And you couldn't just walk in it. No, you glided. With tiny steps. Chin slightly down, eyes up, back straight, arms held close, hands tucked inside the long sleeves, and less gesturing. Older geisha dressed more simply. Their kimono were less vivid, their obi tied in more modest knots. They'd earned the right to be understated, elegance through restraint. Think matte silk instead of gold embroidery. Think stillness over sparkle. Hair? A whole world of its own. Maiko had real hair sculpted into seasonal styles with poetic names like split peach or fallen snow. Each design meant something. The wrong style in the wrong month could make you a punchline. To preserve it, Maiko slept on wooden blocks called takamakura that cradled the neck and kept the hairdo from flattening. Imagine balancing your dreams on a table leg for a year or two, and you get the idea. Geishas, being older, wore wigs. But don't feel too sorry for them. The wigs itched. They were heavy. And if one slipped during a performance, social death. Historians still argue whether this level of grooming was a form of empowerment or imprisonment. Was it performance or submission, self-expression or self-erasure? But the answer might lie in how much control Gaze has had over these details. Because the more senior she became, the more freedom she had to choose her palette, her fabrics, even how daring her makeup might be. Quirky tidbit: some elite geishas in Gion were known for their signature scent, a custom blend of incense and floral oil applied behind the ears or sewn into their sleeves. One was famous for a cherry blossom musk mix, so recognizable that clients claimed they could sense her arrival before the shoji doors slid open. But let's talk about that illusion. Geishas didn't try to look natural. Quite the opposite. They leaned into the surreal, pale as porcelain, lips like a lacquered box. They weren't trying to pass for everyday women. They were meant to exist outside the everyday, ethereal, unreachable, not to be possessed, but to be experienced. And that takes power. A modern audience might assume Gaze has wore makeup to appeal to men, but Geisha culture cared less about male desire and more about ritual, symbolism, and aesthetic perfection. A Geisha dressed for the room, the occasion, the season, not to look sexy. If a client fell under her spell, well, that was his problem. Still, the upkeep was brutal. A Maiko might sit for hours in winter chill, wrapped only in a thin robe, as her makeup set. Her scalp would ache from tight hairpins. Her feet would blister in Zori sandals after a full night of banquets. And the next morning, do it all again. But with every step, every turn of the wrist, every breath taken through rose-tinted lips, she reinforced the geisha's most potent magic, the ability to make art look effortless. One well-known geisha in the 1800s, nicknamed the Crane, was famous for her stillness. She could hold a pose mid-dance, fan lifted, sleeve poised for an entire verse of a song without blinking. When asked how she learned that kind of control, she reportedly replied, "I simply imagine I am not real." That line says it all. Because being a geisha meant living in two bodies, the one you were born into and the one you crafted each night. One belonged to the okia, the other belonged to the floating world. And slipping between the two wasn't just a skill, it was survival. You couldn't just look the part. You had to disappear into it. So the next time you see a photo of a geisha white mask, red mouth, towering hair, don't ask what she's hiding under all that. Ask what she's choosing to reveal. Because every inch is deliberate, and every inch has a story. It begins with a folding fan and a bottle of sake. A low table glows in the light of flickering lanterns. The guests, dressed in fine silk or starched black, are relaxed now, laughing, trading stories, trying not to look too impressed. And there she is, the geisha, seated with perfect posture, poised and amused, spinning a tale about a pompous merchant who fell into a koi pond, trying to impress her with poetry. It lands. Everyone laughs, including the merchant, who's trying not to look mortified. This is Enkai, the banquet. And no, it's not just dinner. It's theater. It's flirtation. It's a social ritual more choreographed than any ballroom waltz. And for the geisha, it's one of her most demanding performances. The typical Enkai might last several hours, sometimes longer. Guests arrived expecting food, drinks, music, and above all, atmosphere. The geisha was there not to serve. Exactly, but to curate. She made the night feel spontaneous, even if she had prepped for it like an actor rehearsing a monologue. Step 1. Balance the energy. Too quiet, and she'd liven things up with a story or a song. Too rowdy, and she'd gently redirect the attention, usually through humor, or by simply placing her fan on the table with a soft thump. That wasn't just a signal to calm down, it was dominance, delivered politely. Her shamisen, always nearby. Its music didn't just fill the room, it shaped it. Certain songs meant playfulness, others, melancholy. She could steer the entire mood of the party without ever standing up. Geishas didn't drink unless invited. But when they did, it was calculated. 1 sip to build intimacy, 2 sips to show camaraderie. More than that, only if she knew she could outpace the client mentally, emotionally, or in a subtle drinking game designed to leave him flustered and flushed while she barely blinked. Historians still argue whether geisha-led banquets were subtle forms of resistance, women dominating a male space through control and charm. Others argue it was performance within confinement, but the fact remains, within those rooms, she held the power. Quietly, invisibly. Want to see that power in action? Watch her pour a drink. She kneels beside a client, lifts the sake bottle with 2 hands, tips it just enough to fill, but not overflow his ceramic cup. She doesn't speak, but her expression says, "Let's see how charming you are now." He, in turn, must return the gesture. Offer to pour for her. If she allows it, it's a small nod of approval. If she politely declines, he should know the night is still young, and the challenge isn't over. Here's a quirky ritual. In some banquets, especially in Kyoto, the geisha would start a hand game, similar to rock, paper, scissors, but layered with gesture, rhythm, and sudden forfeits. Lose the round. You take a drink. Win too many times in a row. She might accuse you of cheating, with a grin so knowing it makes the whole room laugh. These games weren't just filler, they revealed personality. Was the guest shy, aggressive, a sore loser, a flirt? The geisha learned more from 10 minutes of sake play than most could learn from an hour of conversation. And speaking of conversation, she knew every subject: politics, poetry, seasonal festivals, kabuki actors, temple renovations, scandals from 4 districts over. She didn't dominate the talk, she guided it, like a hostess, a talk show anchor, and a therapist rolled into one. Still, her most valuable tool was silence. She knew when to let the pause hang, to let a compliment land without responding, to give a client just enough space to say something slightly too vulnerable and then tuck it away for later. That wasn't manipulation, that was memory, and it made her indispensable. Let's not pretend every guest was elegant. Some were drunks, some were lecherous, some were men who mistook the dream for the woman and assumed that a few extra coins would grant them intimacy. That's where the geisha's discipline came in. She didn't snap, she didn't storm out, she deflected, redirected, or simply left the table for another engagement. One fringe account from the Meiji era tells of a geisha who, when pressed too far by a persistent lord, began reciting death poems mid-conversation, softly, steadily, until the room turned cold. He never booked her again, but he also never returned to that tea house, either, because there was a line, and crossing it didn't just offend her, it embarrassed him, and for many of these men, shame was the most effective leash. So what did the geisha feel during these banquets? Sometimes pride, sometimes exhaustion, sometimes nothing. She might have a headache from the wig, blisters from her sandals, or personal worries tucked behind her painted smile, but she never let it show. Her presence was the product, her performance the brand. Some developed personas for specific types of guests: a playful one for the lonely merchant, a serene one for the grieving widower, a mischievous one for the aging samurai who missed the taste of war but needed someone to remind him he wasn't dead yet. The best Geishas could be all of them, and none of them, depending on the room. One poetic saying from the Gion district goes, "A good geisha is the moon, seen by many but never owned." That illusion was never more present than at the Enkai, because when the night ended, when the guests stumbled out into the lantern-lit streets and the last sake cup was emptied, she would slip back behind the screen, remove her wig, scrub away the makeup, sit quietly while someone unknotted her obi. And if she cried, no one would know. That wasn't part of the show, but most nights, she didn't cry. She just exhaled and prepared to do it all again. The doors are closed, the guests are gone. The lanterns are dimmed to a soft amber flicker, and the shamisen rests in its lacquer case. Outside, the streets of Kyoto hush under a full moon. Inside the okiya, a geisha sits cross-legged in front of her mirror, unmaking the woman she spent hours becoming. The silence after a banquet is thick. It's not just physical exhaustion, though there's that too. It's emotional, because all night long, she's poured herself into illusion. The laughter, the charm, the attention, and now alone, she's still buzzing from it, or hollowed out, or quietly glowing, depending on how the night went. But every now and then, a second silence follows. A deeper one. That's when he stays. Not a client, not technically, not anymore. We've arrived at the realm of forbidden romance, when the lines between performance and feeling blur, and a geisha risks the one thing she's not supposed to, her heart. The geisha code, discouraged, love, strongly. Emotion was considered dangerous, messy, binding, destabilizing. Clients fell in love all the time, of course. That was part of the game. A successful geisha made men think they were special, feel like the only one, but she was not to return those feelings. Not for real, not out loud. And yet, there are journals, letters, even poems hidden behind scrolls and folding screens, all hinting that yes, geishas fell in love, sometimes fiercely, sometimes stupidly, always secretly. Historians still debate how often these romances crossed into the physical. Some say rarely, geishas had too much to lose. Others say more often than we think, especially when patrons became long-term figures in a geisha's life. The truth, as usual, floats in between, but what's clear is that when it happened, it carried real risk. Take the story of Kyo, a famous geisha in the 1820s, who fell for a young samurai from Edo. He was shy, scholarly, and utterly unprepared for her attention. They exchanged fans, hers marked with a plum blossom, his with a crane. In private, he read her Chinese poetry. In public, he pretended not to know her. The relationship lasted 2 years, until his arranged marriage was finalized. She didn't cry, but she wore his fan tucked into her sleeve for the rest of her career. Quiet rebellion, delicately folded. What makes geisha romance so compelling isn't its presence, but its concealment. These weren't flings, they were long glances across rooms, hands brushing during shimas and tuning, letters written in invisible ink or encoded in poetry. Imagine being in love and not being allowed to look like it. There's a tradition in some okiya where if a geisha was suspected of falling in love, her hair was styled plainer, and she was forbidden to perform solo. It wasn't punishment, it was containment. Love, if it got too loud, could break everything. Contracts, patronage, reputation, the illusion itself. One fringe story from Osaka tells of a geisha who dared to run off with her lover. They made it as far as the next province before being found. The man was forced to return to his duties. The geisha was stripped of her name, barred from performing, and last seen working at a rural inn with none of her former elegance. True. Who knows? But the story gets told, and that tells you enough. Still, some geishas did find a path forward. Enter the dana, a patron, sometimes a lover, sometimes both. A dana might financially support a geisha in exchange for exclusivity. It was a complex arrangement, part sponsorship, part relationship, all wrapped in a veil of discretion. Some dana were kind, generous, even loving. Others were possessive, controlling, or simply transactional. But the relationship often lasted years. And in the rarest cases, the geisha married him. But marriage usually meant retirement. And for many geishas, that was not a happy ending. It meant giving up independence, creativity, sisterhood, and the one space in society where they'd held power. It meant stepping off the stage, permanently. Some chose it, others politely declined, saying the performance is not yet over. Romance within the geisha world was, at its best, a quiet bloom in a sea of artifice. At its worst, a scandal, a heartbreak, or a cautionary tale for apprentices to whisper about while practicing fan dances. And still, they love. You can see it in old calligraphy scraps, lines written in moonlight metaphors, with ink smudged where a sleeve brushed the paper. You can feel it in the pacing of a song, suddenly sung slower than usual. You can hear it in the silence between two verses, where nothing happens, except everything. One particularly haunting tale involves a geisha who refused a powerful client's advances for years. Then, one night, she invited him to a private performance. Just one song, she danced without speaking, without smiling, with her eyes cast down. When she finished, she bowed and left. He never saw her again, but he sent her incense each year on the same day, until his death. Did she love him, or did she simply want him to wander? That's the core of geisha intimacy. Not in the embrace, but in the distance. Not in what is said, but in what is very carefully not said. A game played with glances and seasons, with metaphors and shadows, a slow burn that either fades into the next party or leaves you wondering, decades later, if she meant it. So yes, geishas fell in love, just never in the way anyone expected them to. He sits across from her, more nervous than he'd like to admit. The room smells of sandalwood and steamed rice, and somewhere down the hall, someone is tuning a shamisen. She pours his tea, gracefully, flawlessly, but tonight, there's something different in her eyes, something less polished, something a little dangerous. Because he's not just another client, who's her dana. In the world of geisha, the dana system was a delicate, high-stakes arrangement. It was a role balanced somewhere between patron, lover, and unofficial husband, but without the vows, the permanence, or any real promise of happiness. It was exclusive, expensive, and rarely simple. Let's unpack it. The dana tradition began as a way for wealthy men, usually merchants or minor aristocrats, to support a geisha financially in exchange for something deeper than a single night of entertainment. This wasn't just about hiring her services. It was about claiming her, publicly, respectfully, discreetly. He would pay her debts to the okiya, cover the cost of her kimono, her hairdresser, her stylists. He might even fund her own house. In return, she performed less often, took fewer clients and focused her art, her time, her presence on him. But it wasn't a transaction. Not exactly. A dana wasn't guaranteed intimacy. In fact, physical closeness wasn't required at all. What mattered was the connection, the relationship, the idea that she was his, and he was paying for the fantasy that she wanted to be. Historians still debate whether dana relationships empowered geishas or imprisoned them. On one hand, having a dana meant security, stability, a certain social cachet. On the other, it often meant less freedom, fewer performances, and a higher risk of entanglement, especially emotional entanglement, which geishas were definitely not supposed to indulge in. Still, many chose it, and some quietly, scandalously, chose more than one. Here's a fringe case for you. A famed geisha from Gion, known as Koto no Hana, reportedly had two dana at once, each from opposing merchant families. She kept them unaware of each other by staging illnesses on alternating weekends. It worked for nearly 5 years until both men accidentally attended the same New Year's performance. What followed is still referred to in some tea houses as the silent duel. Neither man acknowledged the other all night, but both left before dessert. She retired shortly after, presumably very wealthy. But not all stories ended in quiet luxury. Some dana were possessive, jealous, eager to control not just a geisha's time, but her thoughts. If she was too witty at another man's banquet, too charming to a rival, things could turn tense. While geishas held social power, they were still legally vulnerable. A bad dana could make her life miserable. An abusive one could end her career. One tragic case from the Meiji era involves a young geisha whose dana withdrew his support without warning after years of exclusivity. She returned to her okiya with no savings, no clients, and no backup. Her story became a cautionary tale whispered in training houses. Don't fall, don't rely, don't stop dancing. But let's not paint them all as villains. Some dana were truly supportive. They attended performances without demanding attention, sent gifts instead of orders, respected boundaries, even when the relationship had romantic undertones. In a few rare cases, these bonds lasted decades. Quiet, complicated partnerships filled with poetry, distance, and the occasional letter scented with plum blossom. And yes, some ended in marriage. When that happened, the geisha typically retired. She would leave her name behind, her jimi, and begin life under a new identity. For some, it was a dream come true. For others, a death of the self. Because make no mistake, being a geisha was an identity, not just a job, not just a costume. To give it up meant walking away from everything, your house, your art, your sisters, your reputation, and stepping into a role, where your worth might now be measured in babies, not verses. So many Geishas chose instead to keep their dana at arm's length. Close, but not claiming. Intimate, but not owned. They perfected the art of just enough. One particularly sharp geisha was once asked why she refused a marriage proposal from a powerful politician who'd supported her for years. She replied, "Because I prefer to pour my own tea, subtle, elegant, and devastating." The dana system was full of these contradictions. It offered privilege and pressure, romance and restraint, shelter and shadow. And navigating it required the same skills a geisha used at every banquet: timing, tact, and the ability to smile through anything, even heartbreak. There's a tradition in some houses where, after a dana ends the relationship, the geisha burns one of his gifts: silk, incense, a paper fan, and scatters the ashes along the riverbank at dawn. It's not ritual, it's not revenge, it's release. Because the geisha cannot cling, not to the role, not to the client, not even to the version of herself she created to survive. She bows, closes the door, reapplies the makeup, and keeps dancing. Because that's what she does. And for a few lucky ones, that dance is never for just one man. It's for herself. The day of a misadashi starts long before sunrise. Outside, Kyoto is quiet, the cobbled streets still damp with morning mist. But inside the okiya, everything hums with preparation. Brushes clatter, rice steams, and somewhere in the background, someone is already tuning a shamisen. Because today, a girl becomes a maiko, an apprentice geisha, and the entire district is about to notice. A misadashi isn't just a debut, it's a transformation, an unveiling, and a social event designed to announce, this girl is ready to begin. Not finish, begin. Because despite years of training already behind her, this day marks only the start of the hardest part: learning how to perform while pretending it's all effortless. Let's walk through it. The apprentice's hair is styled in the iconic wear shinobu style, 2 large loops coiled high, dotted with ornate hairpins called kanzashi. Some will be seasonal plum blossoms for winter, cherry for spring, but others are chosen just for the debut: tortoiseshell, silver, even tiny dangling bells that chime when she turns her head. Her kimono is eye-popping. Deep colors, intricate embroidery, sleeves so long they could almost sweep the floor. The collar, red, brilliantly red, thick and padded, telling the world she's still in training. Geisha collars are white and flat. This one says, "I'm still learning, but I'm ready to be seen." The abaya, the abaya, the abaya. It's long, ridiculously long. Nearly 5 meters of brocade silk, folded and tied into a boxy trailing knot that takes serious muscle to secure. It hangs low and heavy, like a ceremonial weight, and in a way it is, because this girl is no longer anonymous. She is, from today forward, a public figure. The misadashi begins with formal visits to local tea houses and sponsors. She'll bow carefully, deeply at each stop. Her wani-san, the senior geisha who now becomes her mentor, walks beside her, correcting her posture with invisible gestures. They stop to greet patrons, Hakaya mothers, shopkeepers and performers, each offering congratulatory gifts, each assessing this new face behind the makeup. Make no mistake, this is not a relaxed affair. It's a performance, and the entire neighborhood is the audience. Apprentices are expected to greet everyone with perfect manners. They speak in Kyoto Ben, a specific dialect that's melodic, slightly archaic, and notoriously difficult for outsiders to imitate. Even the wrong pitch can betray you as uncultured. Historians still argue whether the misadashi is a celebration or a test. Some say it's meant to uplift. Others claim it's designed to intimidate, to see who cracks under the pressure. Both are probably true. Because being a maiko isn't about comfort, it's about composure. Here's a quirky tradition. During her debut, the new maiko may carry a folded fan tucked into her sleeve, not to use, but as a signal. If she drops it, even once, it's seen as an omen of clumsiness. It's been known to haunt reputations for years. No pressure. By afternoon, her cheeks ache from smiling. By evening, she's expected to attend her first proper azashiki, a banquet, not to perform, but to observe, to sit beside her mentor and watch how it's done. How the older geisha turns a dull conversation into sparkling banter. How she manages how she plays kitsune ken, the fox game, without once breaking eye contact with the client. The new Maiko sits quietly, mimicking the posture, folding her hands inside her sleeves, absorbing every detail. She doesn't speak unless spoken to, and even then she's brief, polite, careful. It's a crash course in everything that can't be taught at geisha school. Later that night, back at the okiya, the makeup is removed in silence. The hairpins set gently in their box, the collar folded, and the girl, tired beyond words, sits alone for a few minutes before crawling onto her narrow futon. Does she cry? Some do, quietly, not out of sadness exactly, but from the weight of it all, the pressure, the pride, the fear of failure, mixed with the thrill of possibility. Because from this day on, she's not just a girl, she's a name. Her Jaime, chosen just before her debut, often a combination of poetic references or symbols. White moon, autumn mist, crimson willow. It's more than a stage name, it's a persona, a character she will inhabit for the next decade or more. And if she's lucky, it becomes legend. There's a famous saying in Kyoto's geisha community: the name dances long after the feet stop moving. Some names are still whispered 100 years later. A flick of a fan, a glance over the shoulder, a joke told with perfect timing. These moments don't fade, they ripple forward. But there's another saying, just as common, just as sharp. A mizadashi opens the door. The dancing earns the key, because one perfect debut doesn't guarantee anything. What comes next is years of banquets, rehearsals, heartbreak, and doubt. The smile must stay sharp, the body must not break, and the illusion, it must never flicker. Still, that first day matters. It's a statement, a rite, a whispered promise to the floating world that says, I have arrived. And somewhere, perhaps hidden behind the lacquered screens of a tea house, an older geisha watches her walk past. And she smiles, not because the girl was perfect, but because she wasn't. Because she stumbled a little when bowing to the incense master, because her voice cracked when she introduced herself. Because that's how it begins. Not with mastery, but with wanting. You're sitting across from her. Her lips curve into a smile that says she knows something you don't. Her fingers rest lightly on a lacquered fan, and though the room buzzes with chatter, her eyes are fixed only on you. Now, she opens the fan, and doesn't say a word. Welcome to the world of language without speaking, the finely honed code of gestures, glances, and props that geishas used to say everything they weren't allowed to say. Chief among them, the folding fan. It's just a fan, right? Light, delicate, maybe painted with cranes or maple leaves. But in a geisha's hands it was as communicative as a full-blown conversation, if you knew how to listen. And if you didn't, well then you were just a guy getting outsmarted with a paper accessory. Let's start with the basics. A fan opened slowly could signal interest. Opened quickly, irritation. Fanned once beneath the chin while making eye contact. Mild flirtation. But if she tapped it against her palm 3 times while glancing away, congratulations. You just annoyed her, and she'd really rather be pouring sake for someone else. Fans weren't just props, they were punctuation, a way to take control of a room without raising your voice. Because of course, a geisha never raised her voice. Every gesture was precise. Fold the fan and press it lightly to your lips. I'm listening, but I know you're lying. Let it dangle from 2 fingers while laughing softly. You're charming, but I'm not convinced. Use it to hide a smile. Could mean amusement, could mean mockery, or both. Historians still argue whether these codes were universally taught or passed down informally through imitation. Some suggest formal fan language manuals existed within certain okiya circles. Others believe it was more instinctive, a shared language that developed naturally, refined by watching the women who came before you. Regardless, a geisha's control over her props was part of her weaponry. But the fan was just the beginning. Other items carried meaning too. The sensu, a stiff, sometimes scented folding fan used during dances, could be raised to mimic the moon, water, or longing itself. Depending on the choreography, a geisha might spend months mastering a single dance, learning how to hold the fan just so, with exactly the right wrist tension to evoke heartbreak or joy. Her sleeves, too, spoke. A tucked sleeve meant reserve, a dropped sleeve, carelessness, or a carefully staged illusion of vulnerability. A slow movement to adjust her collar might hint at distraction, or desire, or simple fatigue, depending on context. That's the thing with geishas. It was always about context. And the eyes? Oh, the eyes were their own language. Amaiko was taught to glance without staring, to gaze without fixating. A brief look followed by a demure turn of the head could convey shyness, even if she was cataloguing every detail of your behavior. To hold a gaze for more than 3 seconds. That was dangerous, intimate, reserved for those rare moments when the line between performance and connection trembled just a little. And then, there was silence. Silence in the floating world was not absence. It was tension, power. A geisha could bring a banquet to stillness by simply pausing mid-sentence and letting her hand rest gently on the table. No announcement, no shout, just gravity. Her silence demanded attention, and more often than not, received it. Here's a quirky tale from the 1880s. A geisha in Tokyo reportedly once responded to a lewd guest by quietly folding her fan, placing it in front of him, and standing up. She said nothing, just left the room. The guest, mortified, returned the next night with an apology poem written on handmade paper, tied with silk. She never acknowledged it, but she did use the silk to tie her shamisen case. Just visible enough for him to notice. That was the power of implication. You see, the floating world wasn't built for honesty. Not direct honesty, anyway. It thrived on subtext. Clients didn't want bluntness. They wanted to be seduced by implication, challenged by subtlety, invited into a dance where every step was carefully choreographed to make them feel spontaneous. The geisha, of course, was 10 steps ahead. That's why she trained so long. Not just to master instruments or perfect her walk, but to read people, adapt tone, and control the energy of a space with her presence alone. It wasn't manipulation, it was storytelling. Each evening was a scene. The guests were actors, the sake was fuel, the fans were props, and the geisha, she was the director, silently shaping mood, emotion, and memory. And yet, she was expected to disappear into the performance. Never take credit, never correct a guest, never make the art look like work. Some modern scholars say this ability to control without seeming to is the closest thing historical Japanese women had to public power. They couldn't vote, they couldn't own property freely, but inside a tea house, they ruled the emotional weather. Others push back, calling it illusion layered over submission, that judges still lived within systems that commodified them, that no fan gesture could truly shield them from the realities outside the banquet room. Maybe both are true. Maybe that's why the fan mattered so much. It was one of the few things she could control. One of the only tools entirely hers, passed from hand to hand like a secret spellbook. Even today, traditional geishas still train in these gestures. The fan opens, the eyes soften, the silence stretches, and the guest, modern, distracted, phone in his lap, looks up just a little too late and realizes she's already rewritten the entire atmosphere. She doesn't need words. She never did. The tea house is quiet, too quiet. The sake's been poured, the candles lit, and the guests haven't even noticed yet. But there's tension in the air, subtle. Like a koto string tuned just a little too tight. Because tonight, 2 geishas from rival Okoya are in the same room, and one of them is wearing that kimono. The one everyone knows is a copy. Welcome to the world of rivalries. Polished on the surface, cutthroat underneath. It's easy to imagine Geishas as a united sisterhood of artists, sharing songs and tea and secrets. And sometimes that was true, but the reality was more complicated. The geisha world was small, competitive, and full of hierarchy, and when you mix art, pride, and reputation, things get spicy. Let's talk status. Issues were ranked unofficially, of course, by popularity, skill, style, and who their clients were. If you were booked night after night by high-ranking merchants or visiting daimyo, your value rose. If your shamisen playing made other geishis pause in the hallway to listen. Respected. If you had a signature dance, iconic. But with attention came envy. Geishas from different okiya often competed for the same elite clients, especially during festivals and seasonal performances when the demand for entertainment peaked. A single good night could lead to a long-term patron. A single mistake could cost you a year's worth of bookings. So they watched each other closely. Was her kimono newer, her perfume more noticeable? Did she perform the fan dance with a twist she stole from someone else's debut? And worst of all, was she being talked about? Because in the floating world, reputation was currency. There's a deliciously petty tale from 1850s Kyoto about two geishas, both stars of rival houses, who performed the same dance at the annual spring viewing. The younger one performed first. Polished, elegant, flawless. The older one followed and paused halfway through to fix her sleeve. That single gesture was interpreted as mockery, suggesting the first had been sloppy. Was it intentional? We'll never know. But the rumor spread, and for the next year, the younger geisha found herself getting fewer invites. Historians still argue whether these rivalries were exaggerated by later romanticization of the geisha world. Some say most competition was professional, respectful, even friendly. Others claim the quiet sabotage was real, and sometimes deadly serious. We do know this. Some tea houses played favorites. Some patrons pitted geishas against one another, subtly encouraging competition just to see who could hold their attention longer. And okiya mothers, they noticed everything. If one girl started getting more compliments, more gifts, more name drops, her schedule would fill up. Others, they'd get reminded to polish their posture or practice that song again. But not all battles were passive-aggressive. Some were deeply artistic. Geishas would often show off their originality through seasonal motifs, special hairpins, dance interpretations, even choice of verses in poetry duels. Yes, those existed. Imagine two geishas facing off at a gathering, each reciting poems on the spot, matched line for line, smile for smile, subtle dig for subtle dig. The goal wasn't to win, it was to outshine without overstepping, to be unforgettable without looking desperate. A fringe tradition involved a kind of fashion war played out over weeks. One geisha might appear with a unique obi color. Another would echo it a few nights later, but paired with a daring seasonal fabric. By the third week, everyone in the district was watching to see who would twist the trend first and best. It was like runway drama, only quieter and 10 times more stressful. And then there were the stories no one told out loud. The time a geisha's performance appointment was mysteriously cancelled and another showed up instead. The tea house that stopped booking a rising maiko after she openly complimented a rival's dana. The apprentice who accidentally repeated a senior geisha's trademark joke, only to find herself reassigned to cleanup duty for weeks. Subtle punishments, quiet reminders of rank. But let's not forget, geishas were also fiercely loyal to their own. Within an okiya, senior geishas trained juniors, defended their reputations, even took the blame when they saw one stumble. And if someone outside the house insulted their apprentice, oh no, the sisterhood activated fast. There's a story from the 1920s of a visiting businessman who dared criticize a maiko's dance at a banquet. The older geisha beside her said nothing at the time, but at the end of the evening, she offered him a parting song, a gentle melodic lullaby, with a title that translated to, "Those who cannot dance shouldn't watch." The next morning, he sent a formal apology and a very expensive fan. Because while geishas competed, they also understood the deeper truth. They were the keepers of their own myth. And any public scandal hurt all of them. So rivalries, while real, were laced with elegance, controlled, sublimated, turned into theatre. It wasn't just about who was best. It was about who could appear the best without seeming to try. No fighting in the hallway. No raised voices. Just an extra twirl during a dance. A fan folded too fast. A poem that seemed a little too personal. And always, that smile. Not the warm one. The sharp one. The one that says, "You can borrow my style, but you'll never wear it like I do." The curtain rises. The crowd hushes. A samurai struts onto the stage, his robe billowing, his gestures grand, his voice booms, his makeup is painted thick. And off stage, just beyond the curtain, a geisha watches in silence. She isn't in the spotlight, but the spotlight owes her everything. Geishas never performed in kabuki, at least, not officially. But their fingerprints were everywhere, in the costumes, the gestures, the choreography, even the swagger. Because long before the actors took center stage, geishas were shaping the drama from behind the scenes. Let's rewind a bit. Kabuki theater exploded in popularity in the 17th century, originally created by women. Yes, women, who danced, sang, and told bawdy stories that scandalized officials. Predictably, the shogunate banned them, so men took over, playing all the roles including the women. This gave rise to the onagata, male actors who specialized in playing idealized female characters. But where did those actors learn how to act like women? From geisha, not from textbooks, not from imagination, from observation, from endless nights spent in tea houses and pleasure quarters, watching how geishas moved, bowed, smiled, and dismissed foolish guests. With a flick of a fan, the onagata weren't impersonating real women, they were impersonating geishas. And they weren't shy about it. Some openly sought out time with famous geishas, just to study them. One particularly famous kabuki actor in the 1800s reportedly paid double the normal rate just to sit silently in a room with a geisha for an hour, taking mental notes. He claimed her walk contained more wisdom than 100 scrolls. There's even evidence of mutual inspiration. Geishas, in turn, borrowed from kabuki, dramatic head turns, the stylized pauses, the careful way of sitting with one leg slightly tucked, just enough to suggest restraint and grace. A performance, yes, but rooted in lived reality. Historians still argue whether this cross-pollination elevated geishas or diluted their authenticity. Some say they remained purists, never lowering themselves to stage antics. Others suggest they strategically absorbed bits of kabuki flair to keep things fresh. The truth? Likely both. Because while geishas didn't perform in kabuki houses, they often entertained kabuki actors. These weren't shy men. They brought big personalities, big egos, and stories loud enough to fill entire tea houses. And for geishas, these guests were gold lively, influential, sometimes surprisingly generous, and occasionally something more. You see, the worlds of theater and geisha overlapped in quiet corners, shared back doors, after parties, early morning strolls along the canal, after an all-night banquet. Love affairs between geishas and actors were whispered about constantly. Some were short-lived, full of sparks and slammed shoji doors. Others became legendary. One of the most whispered tales from the floating world, a geisha and an onagata who reportedly exchanged roles in private. She would act out his most famous monologues. He would pour tea and play the shamisen. No audience. Just two performers, switching masks, trading power, pure theater, performed for no one but each other. But while kabuki actors had stages, geishas had rooms. Rooms where theater was no less real, just more intimate. One key difference: a kabuki actor could have a bad night. He could forget a line, trip over a robe, get booed and return the next day for a redemption arc. A geisha, she didn't get do-overs. Every evening was high stakes. Every gesture counted. She wasn't playing to the back of a crowd. She was playing to you, 2 feet away, with nothing but candlelight and confidence. There's a quirky little tradition in Kyoto, where geishas attend kabuki openings, not in their own districts, but quietly, anonymously. They sit in the back, not dressed in full regalia, watching how their art has been repackaged, made loud, theatrical, exaggerated. Some smile, some shake their heads, some take notes. Because geishas aren't static, they're artists. And artists steal, respectfully, elegantly. Still, the two worlds remained separate, and deliberately so. A geisha might attend kabuki. She might entertain its stars, but she would never become one. That was another realm, louder, riskier, less controlled. Even the makeup, so similar at first glance, was different. Kabuki whiteface was thick, designed to be seen from the back row. Geisha whiteface was finer, more delicate, meant for candlelit glances across tatami mats. Kabuki eyes were lined in red and black for dramatic effect. Geisha eyes were shaded to draw attention subtly to draw you in, not shout you down. And while kabuki was meant to entertain the masses, geisha performance was exclusive, private, tailored. You didn't clap, you remembered. Yet the irony. Most visitors to Japan saw kabuki before they ever saw a geisha, and many assumed the two were connected, that the woman in the woodblock print was the same as the actor in the playbill, that they both stood for the same thing, elegance, mystery, fantasy. And in a way they did, because both worlds, stage and tea house, fed a shared dream, a Japan of artistry, emotion, beauty just out of reach, a place where every movement meant something and silence could be louder than applause. But for geishas, applause wasn't the point. Control was. A kabuki actor could raise his voice and steal the scene. A geisha could raise one eyebrow and own the room. One performed for crowds, the other performed for power. The tea house is darker than usual. Outside, the rain whispers against the shoji screens, and a candle flickers on a tray of half-finished cups. The samurai sitting at the table has taken off his armor, but not his mask. He laughs at the geisha's story, but only half hears it. His mind is elsewhere, because the world he knew is slipping away. And she knows it. She always does. This was the turning point. The moment when gaze has began to shift from background atmosphere to something far more essential, chroniclers of an era unraveling. Because as the samurai class declined, it wasn't the swordsmiths or the lords who noticed it first. It was the geishas. For centuries, the samurai were the apex of social order. Loyal, brutal, stoic, revered. But by the late Edo period, that order was cracking. Peace had lasted too long. Swords were collecting dust. And without war, many samurai found themselves out of place and out of money, but not out of pride. So where did they go to remember who they were? To the geisha. She didn't just pour sake for them, she preserved their identity. Over quiet dinners, they told her stories of battle, of lost brothers, of generals who once commanded armies, but now kept accounts for shipping firms. And she listened, not with awe, but with precision. She remembered, she asked the right questions. She laughed at the stories meant to be funny, and stayed silent through the ones that weren't. Historians still argue whether geishas were passive observers of this decline or quiet participants in its elegy. But there's no doubt, when power faded from swords to silver, geishas adapted faster than anyone. They had to. With samurai stipends shrinking and class distinctions blurring, their clientele changed. Fewer warlords, more merchants. Money talked louder than bloodlines now, and the geisha houses that thrived were the ones who learned to charm the new elite without insulting the old. It wasn't just a shift in faces, it was a shift in tone. Samurai were solemn, formal. They liked poetry, classical music, political debates. Merchants were rowdier, bolder. They wanted drinking games, sharp-tongued jokes, dances that leaned a little saucy around the edges. A geisha had to code switch like an expert diplomat. One evening, she might be quoting Chinese philosophers. The next, imitating a kabuki actor slipping on a banana peel. And yet, the core remained the same: grace, control, presence. The decline of the samurai brought with it a strange inversion of power. Men who once commanded armies now bowed their heads as they stepped into tea houses, owned by women. And many of those women, they noticed, quietly. They didn't gloat, but they did adjust their pricing. Here's a quirky anecdote. One Kyoto geisha, in the mid-1800s, kept a secret ledger listing each client's behavior grade. Samurai, who tried to pay on credit, docked points. Merchants who over-tipped in front of others also docked. The highest-rated client was reportedly a former warrior who showed up early, poured drinks for the apprentices, and left without asking for anything more than a song. She later said, "He remembered who he was without asking me to pretend I forgot who I was." But let's be clear, the geisha world wasn't immune to instability. As the political system collapsed and the Meiji Restoration loomed, the pleasure quarters, always precarious, came under scrutiny. Reformers wanted to clean up Japan's image for the Western world. That meant stricter rules, more inspections, and a growing discomfort with the idea of women being too powerful, too independent, too central. And yet, the geisha adapted again. They leaned into the cultural artisan identity. Less focus on flirtation, more on heritage. Dance schools rose in prominence. Shamisen competitions became more public. Some geishas even traveled to perform for foreign dignitaries, not as hostesses, but as national symbols. Still, they carried the weight of what had been lost. Some older geishas couldn't adjust. Their jokes fell flat on younger merchant clients. Their dances felt stiff. They retired early, watching the tea houses fill with a new kind of man, who didn't understand why you never called a geisha pretty, without also complimenting her fan technique. But the younger geishas, they flourished. Because they understood the secret. When a world ends, someone always writes the epilogue, and in the floating world, the geisha held the pen. One geisha from Jeon was known for her samurai songs, melodies composed from the stories she'd heard over the years. She never named names, never claimed authorship, but every time she performed them, the older guests would go quiet. Sometimes they'd bow as they left. Not to her, exactly, but to something they couldn't quite explain. Maybe regret, maybe gratitude, maybe both. It's easy to romanticize the fall of the samurai, cherry blossoms and empty dojos. But the truth is, most of them faded with a whimper, not a bang. And the ones who mattered most, they left behind stories, fragments, glimpses of what had been. And often they left them in the hands of geishas, who kept them safe, who turned them into art, who made them worth remembering. So when you think of the geisha, don't just see the entertainer or the artist, see the archivist, the witness, the woman who watched power change hands 100 times, and never dropped the fan, because as the sword was sheathed for the last time, the geisha kept dancing, and history danced with her. The port creaked with the weight of change. Ships bobbed in the bay, some bearing silk and porcelain, others carrying European diplomats with thick mustaches and curious eyes. It was the 1850s, and Japan's centuries-old bubble had popped. The West had arrived, and with it came new suits, new technologies, new diseases, and a million misunderstandings, including one very big one, Geishas. To the foreigner's eye, she was exotic elegance wrapped in brocade, mysterious, painted, delicate, a living postcard, the perfect cultural ambassador, the perfect fantasy. The problem, most foreigners had absolutely no idea what she actually was. The misunderstandings started early. When Commodore Perry's black ships arrived to open Japan, emissaries and officers were treated to banquets, some hosted by geishas. They laughed at her jokes, fumbled through sake etiquette, and stumbled home believing they had just been lavishly courted by the nation's version of a high-class mistress. Except, she wasn't. She was playing her role, entertainer, not escort. But the West had no context for women who were trained in arts, didn't marry, dressed like royalty, and spoke fluently with powerful men, yet were not prostitutes. So they labeled her anyway. From the Meiji Restoration forward, as Japan raced to modernize and westernize, the role of the geisha became both more respected and more misunderstood. On one hand, the government leaned into geishas as a symbol of traditional Japanese refinement, something to present at diplomatic events, world expos, and foreign visits. On the other hand, the lines blurred. Some geisha houses embraced the attention. Western guests paid well and tipped extravagantly. Some even fell in love, or thought they did, with the mystery, the manners, the practiced intimacy of the experience. Others simply wanted a story to take home. There's one famous case from 1887. A visiting German scholar supposedly spent 4 months courting a Kyoto geisha, writing poems, learning shamisen, and attempting haiku. On his final night, he asked her to marry him. She laughed once, bowed, and said, "You should write a book instead." He did. It sold terribly. But the influence of the West cut deeper than awkward proposals. As foreign fashions flooded Japan, young people started questioning old traditions. Kimono were traded for suits and blouses. Hair was cut short. Women entered schools and the workforce. And for some, the geisha became a relic. Beautiful, yes, but backward. Something to preserve, not emulate. Meanwhile, Western curiosity didn't fade. It only grew. And with it came pressure. Geishas were now expected to entertain differently. Some learned bits of French or English to accommodate foreign guests. Others modernized their acts, adding Western instruments, changing their hairstyles, even altering their makeup to appear less theatrical. One Tokyo geisha famously performed a waltz for a British envoy, followed immediately by a traditional fan dance. She later called it an awkward duet between two ghosts. Historians still debate whether this adaptation was survival or dilution. Some say it allowed geishas to remain culturally relevant. Others believe it forced them to become caricatures of themselves, playing into foreign fantasies rather than preserving authentic art. The reality was more nuanced. Geishas walked a razor-thin line between tradition and evolution, between what Japan wanted to be and what the West expected it to be, and often they were caught in the middle. Here's a quirky but telling moment. During a diplomatic visit in 1905, a geisha presented a Western diplomat with a fan decorated, not with cherry blossoms but with a Union Jack and Mount Fuji. He was delighted. She was mortified. She later gave the same fan to a child in the neighborhood, saying, "May you use it to shoo flies and lies." Yet even as the world changed, the core of geisha life remained rigorous training, endless refinement, subtle power. The geisha didn't disappear. She adapted. She retreated from public curiosity and leaned deeper into her roots. Some districts, like Kyoto's Gion, doubled down on exclusivity. No photographs, no walk-ins, no foreign bookings, unless through carefully vetted introductions. If you didn't know the rules, you didn't get through the door. And for those who made it through, a glimpse of a culture untouched by modern noise. A space where time moved slower, where voices were soft, where beauty was built from restraint. Of course, not every geisha had that choice. Some were pressured to play along with Western expectations, singing translated ballads, posing for postcards, being paraded at international exhibitions like living museum pieces. Their reality became something halfway between artistry and tourism. One Maiko in the early 20th century was reportedly told, "Smile wider, Westerners think you're sad." She complied, then privately practiced how to frown so subtly it looked like a smile. A quiet rebellion painted in powdered white. The Western gaze didn't kill the geisha tradition, but it twisted it, and yet they endured. Because they had before, through samurai and merchants, through civil wars and rice famines, the geisha knew how to bend without breaking. One quote, written by a geisha in a private memoir from 1912, puts it best. "They come with coins and cameras. I give them cherry blossoms and forgetfulness. But the real spring, my spring, blooms when they leave." The West may have brought intrusion, but it also brought attention, and that attention, awkward as it was, forced the geisha to clarify her role, not just to foreigners, but to herself. She was not for sale. She was not for display. She was the quiet heart of a country, learning how to balance the old world and the new. By now, you've probably realized being a geisha required more than graceful steps and a coy smile. Behind the lacquered screens and perfumed silk, there was something else entirely: school, real, rigorous, and relentless. Welcome to the classroom. If the tea house was the stage, the kabarenjo, the geisha rehearsal hall, was the boot camp. Here, geishas didn't flirt or perform. They trained for hours, sometimes for years, and they weren't just learning how to pour tea or walk in zori sandals. No, this was full-blown cultural combat training. Dance, music, singing, calligraphy, poetry, dialect. And yes, there were tests. Let's start with the schedule. A Maiko in training might rise before dawn. Her first stop wasn't a mirror, it was a dance studio. Wooden floors, bare feet, mirrors that reflected every wobble, every drooping wrist. She'd repeat the same movement 100 times until it looked effortless, until it was effortless. Traditional geisha dances are symbolic. Every motion means something. Tilt your head the wrong way, you might be evoking grief instead of longing. Let your sleeve flick too wide, you've turned flirtation into clumsiness. And the instructors, usually stern older women who never raised their voices, would correct you with a glance sharp enough to slice tofu. Then came shamisen lessons, 3 strings, no frets, and a world of trouble. The shamisen is deceptively simple looking, but learning it was like learning to sing and wrestle. at the same time, with a plank of polished wood. One missed note, and your whole rhythm collapsed. Geishas didn't just strum, they evoked entire seasons, entire poems, entire personalities. You didn't pass these lessons by showing up. You passed by enduring. One Maiko from the early 1900s wrote in her diary that she practiced the same 6-note melody every day for 4 months before her instructor nodded for the first time. When that nod came, she said it felt like a wedding, but perhaps the most challenging lessons were in presence. In Geishas school, you learned how to listen, how to smile at a joke you'd heard 20 times without seeming fake, how to sense when someone in the room needed silence or tension or a song. This wasn't something you could write on a test, but the instructors could always tell who had it and who didn't. Speech training was another beast. Geishas spoke in Kyoto Ben, a refined, almost poetic dialect that came with its own vocabulary and tone. Mispronounce one vowel, and you sounded like a fishmonger. Get the rhythm wrong, and you might insult someone instead of complimenting them. And of course everything was seasonal. Geisha etiquette changed with the calendar. How you folded your fan, what flowers you wore, the verses you recited, it all shifted depending on the time of year. Autumn demanded melancholy, spring, optimism, summer, playfulness. If you got your mood wrong, even a perfect performance could fall flat. Here's a quirky exam fact. Some geisha schools gave oral tests, where the student had to match traditional dances with poems written centuries earlier, then perform a short improv segment that bridged the two emotionally. Not only did you need to know the poem, the meaning, and the dance form, you had to feel it. If you hesitated, failed. Historians still debate whether this level of formality helped preserve tradition or suffocated it. Was this intense schooling a gateway to empowerment or an elaborate cage? Some say it gave women rare agency as cultural keepers. Others argue it boxed them in with rules wrapped in ribbon. But many geishas loved it. Because within these rules, they found mastery, confidence, control. Geisha exams weren't like school in the Western sense. You didn't pass or fail in a letter grade, but your readiness was public knowledge. Your mistashi would only be arranged after your teachers agreed, often unanimously, that you were ready to debut. And even then, the real tests began. There's an old saying among geishas: school teaches you how to dance, the party teaches you why. Because all the training in the world couldn't prepare you for the unpredictability of live entertainment. The samurai who got drunk too early, the merchant who asked too many questions, the rival geisha who arrived in a better kimono. These weren't written into the curriculum, but they were part of the education. Still, the exams remained central. In many districts, geishas were expected to take periodic assessments to maintain their standing. These could include performances in front of elders, recitation of poetry, or formal tea ceremonies. Some districts even published public rankings, a terrifying prospect for geishas trying to prove they hadn't lost their edge. One particularly bold Maiko in the 1930s reportedly improvised a completely new dance during her final exam, based on a story about a fox spirit trying to pass as human. Risky. Could have bombed, but it earned her a standing ovation. That performance became part of her name. To this day, she's remembered in old records as Kitsune no Mai, the fox's dance. Still, not everyone passed. Some girls washed out early, sent home with apologies, and often shame. Others made it through the training, only to freeze during their first real banquet. There were second chances, sometimes, but the geisha world didn't wait. It moved forward, fan twirling, shamisen humming, hairpins gleaming in the candlelight. So the next time you see a geisha perform a quiet, simple bow, remember, behind that movement is years of training, endless repetition, and probably at least 3 near-nervous breakdowns involving a shamisen string that would not tune properly. She makes it look effortless, because she worked too hard to let you see the effort. The drums beat slower now, the fan turns just once. Outside, blackouts darken the streets, and the tea houses close earlier than usual. Something is wrong. There's a tension that even the best trained geisha can't charm away, because tonight there are soldiers instead of merchants, uniforms instead of silk, And no one is here for music. Japan is at war. For the geisha, World War II brought not just hardship, but an identity crisis. How does one preserve beauty, tradition, and art when the world is falling apart? It began slowly. As Japan militarized in the 1930s, the government began reshaping every part of society to serve the state, including the geisha districts. At first, the changes were subtle. A reduction in frivolity, a quiet discouragement of luxury entertainment. But soon came rationing, restrictions, then orders. Some geisha were forced to close shop. Many were encouraged to perform patriotic songs instead of romantic ballads. Shamisen music gave way to militaristic chants. Even kimono patterns were scrutinized. Floral motifs were out. Stronger, nationalistic themes were in. And yet, Geishas persisted, because their art was their armor. Even when tea houses went quiet, many geishas found ways to survive, offering pared-down performances, shifting to smaller, more discreet venues, or even changing their art altogether. Some taught children traditional dance in hidden studios, others performed for officers, trying to maintain dignity in rooms where silence was more dangerous than poor posture. Historians still debate whether geishas during wartime were collaborators, victims, or quiet resistors. Some were seen at military banquets, serving drinks to generals. Others secretly helped families hide heirlooms in okiya basements, or funneled information to resistance members. The floating world, once just metaphor, became a place to hide in plain sight. Here's a strange twist. Geisha status, ironically, protected some women from being conscripted into comfort stations, military brothels that became one of the darkest stains in Japan's wartime history. While many civilian women were coerced into these roles, registered geishas were officially excluded. Their licenses, their training, their networks acted as a buffer, but protection came at a price. They were expected to maintain the illusion of normalcy. One Maiko's diary, from 1942, describes a party where she played shamisen while bombs fell in the next district. She wrote, "We drank, but no one laughed. The fan I held felt like a blade. Air raids brought new dangers. Many okiya were destroyed in bombings. Entire districts vanished. Geishas lost their homes, their kimonos, their instruments. Some scattered to the countryside, living with relatives, or retreating into other professions. School teachers, factory workers, seamstresses, a few simply disappeared, but some refused to leave. In Kyoto, Gion stayed intact, miraculously untouched by the Allied bombing campaigns. Some say it was spared intentionally, preserved as a cultural relic. Whatever the reason, the geishas who remained became living museums, holding ceremonies, playing ancient songs for half-empty rooms lit by candles instead of lanterns. There's a haunting account of one geisha who performed a tea ceremony for a group of injured soldiers, most missing limbs, some blind. She spoke not a single word during the ritual. She didn't smile. She didn't pour sake. She just moved with absolute grace, each motion slower than tradition required, as if time itself had been shattered and she was piecing it back together, one fold at a time. The men wept. She never looked up. Quirky wartime rule. Geishas had to register for permits just to purchase cosmetics and hair oil. Some created their own makeup from rice powder and charcoal. Lip color was improvised using crushed flower petals or even food dye. The elegance didn't stop. It simply adapted. But there were losses that couldn't be covered with powder. Many okiya mothers died in bombings. Generations of dancers were scattered. Entire schools of shamisen technique were lost because the only surviving instructor fled without her instruments and died before teaching again. And then, it ended. The emperor spoke. Japan surrendered, and American boots hit the ground. To the occupying Allied forces, the geisha world was an enigma. Soldiers called every woman in a kimono a geisha, even if she was a street vendor or a noodle seller. True geishas recoiled, but they also knew the illusion must be controlled, or someone else would control it. Some geisha districts tried to re-establish order quickly. They published pamphlets explaining what a geisha was, and pointedly, what she wasn't. They closed their doors to GIs. They clung to ceremony like it was oxygen. Others, more desperate, blurred the lines. A new figure emerged, the Pan girl. Often mistaken for geishas by foreign soldiers, these women wore Western clothes, spoke broken English, and worked in bars near bases. They were not trained entertainers, they were survivors. But the damage was done. The Western misunderstanding of geishas as high-class sex workers cemented itself in this moment. A confusion born of war, language gaps, and desperation. The real geishas, those who had held onto tradition with bleeding fingers, now had to fight not just for survival but for reputation. One elder geisha famously said during a post-war interview, "I would rather dance for ghosts than explain myself to one more foreigner." Still, she danced, because that's what geishas do. They persist, even when the world burns, even when the guests don't understand the song, even when the fan folds and there's no one left to notice. They are not entertainers, they are witnesses. And in the ruins of war, they picked up the pieces of their art and rebuilt it, not perfectly but fiercely. The tea houses reopened, the shamisen was restrung, the makeup returned, and somewhere in Kyoto, a new apprentice took her first careful steps, wearing borrowed shoes, beneath the gaze of 1,000 memories. The war was over, the soldiers gone, the streets buzzed again, this time with neon lights, American jukeboxes, and something far more disorienting than bombs. Modernity. Post-war Japan was rebuilding, fast. The skyline stretched upward, the food changed, the clothes changed, the music, radios now blasted jazz instead of shamisen. And through it all, the geisha stood quietly in her wooden sandals, asking the same question as everyone else. Now what? The post-war years were not kind to geishas. They weren't hunted or humiliated, but they were misunderstood, mistaken, and increasingly out of place. Their world had survived war, now it had to survive irrelevance. Let's rewind for a moment. In the 1950s, Japan was desperate to modernize. The national focus turned toward economics, industry, Western fashion, and rebuilding its global image. The geisha, with her layered kimono and old-world grace, didn't quite fit that picture. To make matters worse, the misunderstanding planted during the US occupation had taken root and spread like bamboo. Western media, magazines, movies, even pulp novels, casually conflated geishas with prostitutes. The word became shorthand for a certain kind of exotic fantasy, packaged and exported like silk souvenirs. And the geishas, they watched it happen with powdered faces and gritted teeth. Some tried to adapt. They offered performances in Western hotels, swapped shamisen for piano accompaniments, translated their poetry, smiled more for the camera. Others retreated. Entire districts went quiet. Apprenticeship numbers dropped. Yokiya mothers, once guardians of fiercely protected traditions, now had to fend off real estate developers and public indifference. But they weren't done. Because if there's one thing the geisha world knew how to do, it was evolve quietly. They began to tighten the circle. Instead of competing with the glitz of hostess clubs and nightclubs, geishas leaned deeper into authenticity. Lyon, Pontoko, and other historic districts doubled down on exclusivity. They re-emphasized the original pillars of geisha artistry: music, dance, ceremony. They taught the difference between performance and performance for pay. And slowly, very slowly, the world began to remember. In the 1960s and 70s, Japanese scholars and cultural ministries took notice. Preservation campaigns were launched. Grants appeared for traditional arts. Documentaries, interviews, and photo essays aimed to reclaim the geisha from caricature and restore her to her rightful place as a cultural artisan. Still, it wasn't easy. Public interest was fickle. Pop idols were rising. Television was everywhere. Who wanted to watch a slow, wordless fan dance when you could watch a variety show with slapstick and singing? One retired geisha was asked in 1975 what it felt like to be part of a dying art. She smiled and replied, "It feels like being a candle in a room full of flashlights, but I still give off light." Quirky fact: some geisha has tried light modernization within the art. One Kyoto house incorporated jazz-inspired shamisen rhythms into traditional songs for a short time. Another attempted bilingual banquets, with awkward results. Would you like some say came out as you drink rice hot? Yes, to the confusion of more than one businessman. But for every experiment that flopped, there were quiet victories. The 1980s brought a resurgence in interest, especially among Japanese women who began to see geishas, not as submissive figures, but as disciplined artists. Some saw the geisha as a kind of feminist icon, a woman trained to entertain men, yes, but on her terms. Owning the space, controlling the conversation, unmarried, unowned, and unbothered. More apprentices joined, the schools began filling again. Some old instructors came out of retirement to teach one last generation. Still, it wasn't the same. Technology had changed things. Fewer clients wanted long nights of subtle conversation. Booking a geisha became more of a luxury than a regular indulgence. And many modern Japanese people, especially men, were intimidated by the idea, the etiquette, the cost, the pressure not to embarrass oneself. So the geisha world shrank, not vanished, just concentrated. One charming story from the late 1990s tells of a geisha who began performing for audio recordings, reading haiku into vintage microphones for collectors of ambient sound. She reportedly asked the producer, "Can you hear the silk in my voice?" When they said yes, she agreed to record 20 poems. She never accepted payment, just a box of incense and a lunch at her favorite noodle stand. Because for many post-war geishas, preservation wasn't just a duty, it was survival. And they became curators of the past. Not nostalgic, but stubborn. Precise. Intentional. By the 2000s, Geishas became more visible again, but through a new lens. Not fantasy. Not scandal. Art. Tourism exploded. Visitors to Kyoto hoped to glimpse a Maiko hurrying down an alley at dusk, face half-shadowed, sleeves fluttering like wings. Some mistook actresses in costume for the real thing. Others got lucky. But the gaze has never chased the spotlight. They allowed it in, briefly, and only on their terms. Historians note that many post-war geishas have refused media interviews altogether. One famously told a reporter, "If you want to know me, book me." That wasn't arrogance, it was ritual. Because post-war, the geisha world didn't collapse. It refused to explain itself. In a country that changed everything, education, industry, diet, even greetings, geishas preserved something. A way of being slow, a way of being deliberate, a way of saying, not everything needs to be understood at once. She sits across from the mirror, fingers trembling just slightly as she adjusts her collar, not her kimono, her blouse. Her hair is loose, unpinned. Her face is bare, no powder, no lipstick. She's not in the Okiya anymore. She's not anyone's apprentice, not anyone's one-san, not anyone's muse. She's divorced from the geisha world. Yes, it was possible. No, it wasn't easy. You see, the geisha life was never a prison. It felt like one sometimes, especially to outsiders, but the truth is more complicated. Geishas could leave, some did, many did, but like with any role so completely absorbed into your identity, leaving meant shedding skin. Let's talk about what that process looked like. A geisha didn't quit the way you quit a job. There was no resignation letter, no final paycheck. Instead, she retired, a decision wrapped in ritual, subtlety, and often silence. The word for this was hikami, and it came with weight. There were two main paths out, aging out of performance, or marrying. The former was gradual, the latter was abrupt. If a geisha chose to retire, she usually discussed it first with her oke-san, the mother of her okeya. This was less like telling your boss, and more like telling your adoptive parent, that you're leaving home. It could be warm, it could be fraught. Either way, it was definitive. She might have a final performance, a quiet dance, a farewell banquet. Some gave gifts to their mentors, their apprentices, the tea house that hosted their first solo show. A few made it public. Most did not. The world outside the karaoke, the flower and willow world, didn't need to know. Then came the J-May, her geisha name. It didn't come with her. Once she left, that name was retired too. Sometimes passed down, sometimes buried. but never reused casually. It had been more than a name. It had been a persona, a role she lived and breathed, and now she'd have to live without it. It's hard to explain what that means without sounding dramatic. But imagine losing the version of yourself that had learned how to charm a room with a look. The part of you that moved in rhythm with centuries-old tradition, that could tie an obi in your sleep, that once sang under the lanterns and knew exactly when to stay silent. Now, you're just a woman, and that woman has bills. Maybe a limp from years of dancing in stiff shoes. Maybe a hand that won't stop shaking when the music stops. Some married. A few even married their Dana. For those, the transition could be bittersweet. Love, finally, without pretense. But also, responsibility. No more layered identity. Just wife. Sometimes, mother. And that didn't always go smoothly. There's a story told in Gion about a retired geisha who married a wealthy merchant only to return to her okya 2 years later, not to work, but to watch. She'd sit quietly in the back room during banquets, occasionally offering tips to the newer girls. When asked why she came back, she simply said, "The food at home is warm, but the music is cold." Others left for practical reasons. They opened restaurants, taught shamisen, opened up kimono rental shops for tourists who didn't know how to properly hold a fan. A few trained the next generation, bringing a stern elegance to the rehearsal rooms, and some disappeared altogether, blending into the rhythm of city life in Tokyo or Osaka, walking down the street without turning heads for the first time in decades. And yet, the geisha never fully leaves. There's something about the way they move, sit, pour tea. Even in civilian clothes, you can tell. One hand always tucked just so. One pause too deliberate before speaking. It's in their DNA. Quirky note, some retired geishas are still called by their jamea within the community, even if they haven't performed in years. Not out of disrespect to tradition, but out of affection, like the nickname you give to a retired actress who used to command the stage with a flick of her sleeve. Still, the identity shift is hard. A modern historian once interviewed several retired geishas and asked what they missed most. The most common answer, the silence. Not the silence of being unseen, but the curated, charged silence of the tea house. The kind that wasn't awkward, but expectant. The kind where your next word could tilt the night toward joy or melancholy. That silence was power. And it doesn't exist in supermarkets or train stations. One geisha turned teacher confessed she sometimes whispered poetry to herself while cooking dinner, just to feel the rhythm of her old world. Another said she still woke at 4 a.m., instinctively reaching for hairpins she no longer wore. And then there were those who came back. A small, rare number of geishas, unretired, usually older women, returning not to perform but to mentor. They rejoined their okya, taught apprentices, and occasionally sat in on banquets just to lend weight to the room. Their presence said, "This is real. This is still alive." One was famously quoted as saying, "I left when I had no more to give. I returned when I had more to protect." Because that's what it becomes. In the end, not just a performance, but a legacy. And while leaving the geisha life meant giving up your name, your rituals, your space, it never meant giving up the art. It lived in the bones, in the breath, in the way your fingers rested on the rim of a teacup, even decades later, like the music might start again at any moment. If there's one name most people know when they think of geishas, it isn't a real one, it's Sayuri, a character born not from the backstreets of Kyoto, but from a best-selling novel written by an American man, Memoirs of a Geisha by Arthur Golden. And while the book dazzled readers worldwide, it also did something else. It blurred reality with fantasy, so thoroughly that for many, fiction became fact. Tonight we step into the tangled world of geisha misconceptions and how their legacy was hijacked, glamorized, misinterpreted, and in a few cases misused. Let's start with the novel. Published in 1997, Memoirs of a Geisha was a runaway success. Set in pre- and post-war Japan, it tells the story of a young girl sold to a geisha house and her eventual rise to fame, all while secretly yearning for a man who once showed her kindness. The book is written in first person, as if the main character herself is telling her story. Except, she was. Golden, the author, interviewed real geisha, most famously Minako Beheswasaki, once one of Gion's most elite and high-profile geishas. She agreed to speak with him under the condition that her identity remain anonymous. He published her name anyway. She was furious, not just at the betrayal, but at the way he portrayed the geisha world. Because in the book, key rituals like the mizuage, a ceremony marking a maika's transition to geisha, are sensationalized. In real life, mizuage was a celebratory debut. In the book, it's depicted as a kind of auction deflowering. This was not a small mistake. It fed into one of the most damaging Western misconceptions, that geishas were prostitutes in silk, and the world believed it. Minako Iwasaki responded by publishing her own memoir in 2002, Geisha, A Life, where she clarified everything: the discipline, the training, the boundaries, the art. She didn't write with fantasy or flair, just the truth, woven with quiet pride and visible frustration. She wanted people to know that being a geisha meant hours of rehearsal, centuries of tradition, and zero tolerance for being mistaken as something you weren't. Still, memoirs endured. Then came the movie. Released in 2005, Memoirs of a Geisha starred Chinese actresses in the lead roles, a controversial choice given the deep cultural and political tension between China and Japan. The production spared no expense: breathtaking sets, sweeping music, haunting visuals. But for those in Japan, especially those in the geisha districts, it felt like watching your own reflection, distorted and made to dance. The film doubled down on tropes: the forbidden love, the hypersexualized costuming, the implication that every banquet was one breath away from becoming an affair. It was gorgeous. It was atmospheric. It was wrong. Geisha communities responded with restraint, but the impact lingered. Tourists flooded Jian, expecting flirtation. Some followed real geishas through the street, with cameras. Others tried to book geisha evenings assuming they'd end in intimacy. It got bad enough that in 2019, Kyoto posted signs banning photography in certain geisha alleys. Fines were issued. Tourists were warned. Because the line between fascination and entitlement had been crossed. Historians still argue whether the novel and film helped or hurt geisha culture. Some say it brought new interest, helping preserve the tradition. Others say it diluted meaning, reducing a sacred art form to a plot device. The truth is messy. The novel did introduce millions of people to the word geisha and made them curious. Some dug deeper, some visited respectfully, some even applied to geisha schools, non-Japanese women included. More on that soon. And the renewed visibility kept a fading tradition in the global conversation. But it also forced geishas to constantly explain themselves, to clarify, correct, and distance. One Jian Geiko was asked in an interview what she thought of Memoirs of a Geisha. She smiled and said, "It's like watching a kabuki actor try to play the emperor. The makeup is nice, the walk is wrong." Quirky fallout. After the film's release, kimono rental shops in Kyoto saw a spike in requests for Sayuri-style looks, despite those outfits being inaccurate mashups of maiko and geisha wear, with exaggerated sashes and too white makeup. Some tea houses even had to retrain staff to handle the new wave of curious and confused foreign guests. But the geisha world did what it always does. It adjusted, gracefully, firmly. New websites were launched to educate guests. Tour guides partnered with Okia to explain etiquette. Some geisha houses began offering carefully curated cultural experiences, not to commercialize tradition, but to control how it was presented. Because if you don't tell your own story, someone else will. And the geisha story deserves better than being crammed into a love triangle with a warlord. In the end, memoirs may have romanticized and distorted, but it couldn't erase. Because every time a geisha walks down an alley in Kyoto, the air shifts. Tourists hush. The world holds its breath. Not because of a book, not because of a film, but because centuries of art, silence, and poise are moving past you. And if you're lucky, you'll forget Sayuri altogether. In a quiet Kyoto alley, under a swaying paper lantern, she stands. Her kimono is pale lavender, her obi patterned with pine needles and snow, subtle, elegant. Her hair is styled traditionally, though the shine is synthetic. She bows slightly before entering the tea house, balancing her shumasin case in one hand and a thermos of green tea in the other. She is a modern geisha, and yes, she still exists. You might be surprised. After all, the popular narrative says gays, as our relics, vanishing figures from a forgotten era. But while the numbers have dropped, and the streets are quieter, the tradition is not dead. In fact, in cities like Kyoto and Kanazawa, it's very much alive, just different. Let's start with the numbers. In the 1920s, there were tens of thousands of geishas across Japan. Today, the number hovers around 1,000, and that includes both fully trained daiko and their apprentice maiko. Most of them are concentrated in 5 official geisha districts, or hanamachi, with Gion and Kyoto being the most famous. But what's changed isn't just quantity, it's context. The clients are different. Fewer merchants, more business people, academics, and curious cultural enthusiasts. The events have shifted to fewer all-night drinking banquets, more daytime performances, workshops, or private recitals for small groups. And the women themselves, they've changed too. Many modern geisha come from middle-class families. They're not sold or adopted into okiya. They apply, voluntarily, sometimes with resumes. Some are in their 20s or even 30s when they begin. Many choose the path for love of art, not necessity. One maiko famously left a university degree in international relations to study dance and shamisen full-time. Her parents were shocked, her friends confused. But she said, "I want to live inside beauty. I want every day to begin with ritual and end with meaning." Modern training is still intense, still steeped in history, but it now coexists with smartphones, bullet trains, and online booking systems. And while traditionalists wince, others see it as the only way to survive. One of the most profound changes: agency. Today's gays often have far more control over their schedules, earnings, and lives. They can choose their clients, they can marry without scandal, they can retire and re-enter the world without shame. Some even start their own okiya, breaking from the old hierarchy and forging something newer. Hybrid houses that balance reverence with realism. There's a wonderful example in Tokyo, where a former geisha opened a small tea salon offering condensed cultural evenings, shamisen, calligraphy, a short dance, and Q&A over wagashi. Touristy, a little, but respectful, intimate, and crucially educational. Historians note this shift as a survival strategy. By redefining the geisha as a cultural ambassador instead of an elite entertainer, they remain relevant without diluting the tradition. Still, challenges persist. The makeup, for example, remains a lightning rod. Some modern geishas have scaled it back, especially for daytime appearances, arguing that the art is in the movement, not the mask. Others hold fast. The white face, they say, isn't just tradition, it's armor. Then there's the economy. Training is expensive. Kimono are astronomically priced. One full ensemble can cost thousands of dollars. Maintaining the tea house, paying instructors, renting space for performances, it adds up. Many modern geishas work additional jobs, teaching, consulting, even collaborating with fashion brands. One geisha recently partnered with a Japanese skincare line to create a series inspired by seasonal motifs. Was it commercial? Sure. Was it smart? Absolutely. Because the modern geisha isn't stuck in the past. She's curating it. Quirky shift. Some geishas now use Instagram, not to post selfies but to promote performances, educate followers on etiquette, or share behind-the-scenes glimpses into rehearsals. One popular account shows the process of tying a traditional obi from start to finish, set to ambient music. The comments are full of awe, gratitude, and just a little confusion. And yes, there are still taboos. Dating remains tricky. Public romantic entanglements are frowned upon, not because geishas are forbidden to love, but because mystery is part of the art. A geisha who posts her boyfriend on social media isn't breaking a rule, she's breaking the spell. Because even now, the modern geisha walks a line between presence and distance, between being of this world and somehow just outside it. It's a role, yes, but it's also a real life. She takes trains, she goes to the dentist, She has a bank account and probably a favorite cafe. But when she dons her kimono, when she lifts her fan, when the shamisen hums beneath her fingers, she slips into a lineage that stretches back 400 years. She's not imitating the past. She's continuing it. One Kyoto geisha was asked in a recent documentary what the hardest part of being a modern geisha was. She paused, then said, "People think we're shadows. We are not. We are light. But you must slow down to see it." So yes, the geisha still lives. She still dances, still listens, still tells stories that last longer than the evening they're told. She may not be as visible, but make no mistake, she's still there. The streets of Kyoto are alive with lantern light and whispered footsteps. A new Maiko practices her dance beneath the cherry blossoms. Nearby, an older geisha teaches shamisen to a small group of eager students, some Japanese, some foreign. The world outside spins faster, but inside the Hanamachi, tradition breathes steady. The future of geishas is not just about survival, it's about transformation. Because the geisha world has never been static. Even as the centuries rolled on, as samurai gave way to merchants, as war faded into peace, and peace gave way to neon lights and bullet trains, geishas adapted. They absorbed change without losing their core. And today, in the 21st century, they face new challenges and new opportunities. One major shift is globalization. Foreign interest in geishas has exploded. Tourists from every continent flock to Kyoto's Gion district hoping for a glimpse, a photo, or even an experience. Geisha houses now offer cultural evenings tailored to non-Japanese visitors, combining traditional dance, tea ceremony, and stories all in English or other languages. But this influx comes with risks. Commercialization threatens authenticity. Some worry the geisha art form will be watered down to suit tourist expectations. Shorter performances, simpler dances, even staged photo ops that undermine centuries of ritual. Others embrace the chance. Some Akia actively recruit foreign apprentices. Yes, foreign women from Europe, America, Australia have trained to become Maiko and even Geiko. It's controversial. Traditionalists question whether a non-Japanese can truly embody the role. Supporters argue that dedication and respect matter more than birthplace. One British woman, known as Satsuki, completed full training in Kyoto and debuted as a Maiko in 2018. She faced skepticism but also admiration. She speaks fluent Japanese, mastered the shamisen, and navigates tea ceremonies with grace. For many, she's proof that geisha culture can be global without losing depth. Technology also plays a role. Geishas now use smartphones for scheduling, learning, and even sharing art. Online workshops teach shamisen basics to enthusiasts worldwide. Virtual reality projects recreate historic tea houses. The geisha world, once shadowed and secretive, is embracing digital tools, carefully, selectively, to preserve and promote. This raises questions. How do you balance tradition with innovation? When does adaptation become dilution? How do you protect sacred rituals in a world obsessed with speed and convenience? Historians and cultural critics debate this fiercely. Some see the geisha evolution as a metaphor for Japan itself, rooted in history but always reaching forward. Others fear loss of control. Still, many geishas see their role differently. They are not just entertainers. They are cultural custodians, artists, storytellers. They pass down dance forms that date back to the Edo period. They recite poetry from ancient masters. They maintain a living connection to Japan's past, one that no textbook or museum can replicate. One geisha said in a recent interview, "When I dance, I'm not just moving, I'm carrying the steps of hundreds of women who came before me." There's even an emerging movement within the community to document geisha life through modern media, podcasts, documentaries, memoirs written by geishas themselves. These efforts aim to tell the real stories behind the makeup and the fans. And that's the future. A future where geishas are both timeless and timely, where the flicker of candlelight meets the glow of a smartphone screen, where the song of the shamisen competes with the hum of a city, and where tradition isn't a cage, but a dance. A dance that invites anyone willing to learn the steps. The rhythm changes. The lantern light flickers. A Maiko practices a new dance. one that blends classical movements with a hint of jazz rhythm. Her shamisen player experiments with a subtle slide technique that echoes the blue. The world outside is different, and the geisha world is responding in kind. One of the most fascinating modern shifts in geisha culture is the blending of tradition with alternative arts and influences. This isn't a betrayal, it's evolution. From the late 20th century to today, geishas have begun incorporating new elements into their performances and training, while still honoring the centuries-old core. Jazz nights in Kyoto, shamisen mixed with guitar, fan dances, referencing contemporary stories. These are no longer just whispers behind closed doors. They're part of the cultural conversation. Consider the story of a Jaiko in Kyoto, who started a small music ensemble that fused shamisen with jazz drums and bass. At first the elders frowned, but the performances grew popular, especially among younger audiences. It was a bridge, a way to invite new listeners while showing that geisha artistry could speak in new languages. Another example: modern dance choreographers collaborating with geishas to create experimental performances. These works aren't for traditional banquets, but for theaters and festivals. They challenge stereotypes of geishas as fixed, unchanging icons, and highlight their roles as living artists. Even the kimono has seen innovation. Some designers experiment with lighter fabrics and updated patterns that nod to tradition, but feel modern. This helps young geishas move more easily and appeal to new clients who might be intimidated by the weight and formality of classic garments. Historians argue about the implications. Some see these adaptations as crucial for survival, necessary breaths of fresh air. Others warn about losing the thread that ties geishas to their past. But the debate itself reflects a vibrant, dynamic culture, not a static museum. Quirky tidbit: a tea house in Kyoto held an event where geishas performed traditional dances while guests wore virtual reality headsets, showing Edo period Kyoto streets. The audience felt transported, bridging centuries in one night. Technology, art, and tradition intertwine. It's a balancing act, and in this balance lies the future of the geisha. A future where she is not just a memory, but a living, breathing force, adapting, inspiring, and enduring. Because art, like water, finds its way, and the geisha is no exception. The air is thick with incense and quiet anticipation. A group of apprentices huddle in a dimly lit room, their hands trembling over freshly tied obi knots. Their teacher watches, patient but exacting, correcting a single fold with a delicate fingertip. One apprentice whispers nervously about a coming exam, a performance for elders that will determine her future. Exam, tests, trials. The geisha world is no stranger to rigorous evaluation. But unlike the standardized tests many know today, geisha assessments are deeply intertwined with tradition, artistry, and social standing. There is much about emotional intelligence as technical skill. The most significant examination in a geisha's life is the Mizudashi debut we talked about earlier. But it's not the only one. Throughout a geisha's career, she must pass evaluations to progress, maintain status, and even retain the respect of her community. These tests might include dance performances judged by masters, shamisen recitals evaluated for precision and feeling, or tea ceremonies scrutinized for grace and ritual correctness. In some districts, poetry composition and recitation are tested too, because a geisha's wit was as vital as her looks. One curious tradition: some houses hold secret night tests, where apprentices perform dances or songs without audience applause, judged solely by a panel of elders in silence. Passing these tests often means advancement, but failure could lead to demotion or dismissal. Historians debate whether this strict system empowered women by setting high standards or constrained them with impossible expectations. What's clear is that for many geishas, these exams created a lifelong cycle of discipline, pushing them toward mastery, while demanding humility. The stakes are high, because the geisha world is not just art, it's reputation. One misstep in a performance or social interaction can ripple through the district like wildfire. The pressure can be brutal. There are stories of apprentices who fainted mid-performance, of elder geishas who retired early after a poor showing, and of entire okiya houses rallying to support a struggling dancer. The geisha community, while competitive, is fiercely protective. One striking account involves a Maiko who flubbed a major dance during an annual festival. She was devastated, but her Wandi-san gathered the other apprentices and organized extra rehearsals for her, reminding everyone that mastery comes through persistence. The next year, the same Maiko performed flawlessly, earning praise and securing a coveted client. These cycles of trial, failure, support, and triumph define the geisha journey. They forge not only skill, but resilience, community, and identity. Modern times have brought some changes: occasional use of digital tools for training, broader acceptance of diverse backgrounds among apprentices, but the core remains. In this way, the geisha world balances permanence and change, tradition and innovation, art and life. Because every performance is a test, and every test is a step toward perfection. The last lantern flickers low, casting soft shadows that dance along the wooden beams of the okiya. The night breathes slower now, and the city hums quietly beyond the sliding doors. Here, in this moment, we come full circle, tracing the arc of geisha history from whispered secrets to global stage, from silent ritual to vibrant art form. The story of the geisha is one of contradictions, tradition and change, power and submission, mystery and intimacy. It's a narrative woven from silk threads and cherry blossoms, from whispered poems and echoed shamisen notes. It's a story of women who mastered the impossible, holding presence in a world that often tried to silence them. Tonight, we've seen how the geisha evolved, from Edo's floating world to modern Kyoto's quiet streets. We've met apprentices who danced on wooden pillows, masters who carried the weight of centuries in a single bow, patrons who mistook ritual for romance, and artists who transformed limitation into liberation. We've glimpsed the layers beneath the painted face, the discipline, the rivalry, the heartbreak, and the fierce joy. The way a fan can speak louder than words. How silence can command more power than a shout. We've traced the geisha's journey through war and peace, myth and reality, fiction and truth. And as we close this chapter, it's worth remembering that the geisha world is not frozen in time. It breathes, adapts and persists, not as a museum piece, but as living culture. The lights may dim, the shamisen may rest, but the dance continues. So, if you ever find yourself wandering the narrow alleys of Jian at dusk, listen closely. You might hear the faint echo of a song, the soft rustle of silk, the ghost of a fan opening. And in that moment, remember, history isn't just in books. It's in the stories we carry, the rituals we honor, and the dances we never forget. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together.